Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we're taking you on a journey that, well, on its face, sounds completely impossible. I mean, what if you took a 17th century philosophical treatise, mashed it up with William Shakespeare's most, magical play, and then filtered the entire thing through modern hip-hop?
Yeah, it's a premise that really shouldn't work at all.
Right. And and what if the ultimate goal of that bizarre synthesis was to explain the architecture of modern software platforms, specifically this decentralized platform philosophy known as Castle Alpha?
It's honestly wild. The source stack we're examining today is this densely constructed hip-hop concept project. It's titled Novum Organum, Prospero's lab. And we have a really rich stack of materials for this. We've got the creator's extensive structural blueprints, all their commentary notes, and the actual lyrical excerpts from this 7-part musical arc.
Which is, just to be clear for you listening, it's one catalyst track and 6 numbered movements, right?
Exactly. And what emerges from these materials is a rigorous argument that completely reframes Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. It basically takes the traditional story of a wizard on a deserted island and reconstructs it into a masterclass on empirical science, deep systems engineering, and, maybe most importantly, the true meaning of accumulating and then releasing power.
And the reason we're bringing this to you today is that the implications extend way beyond literary analysis. Like whether you're a systems architect trying to build scalable software or a founder navigating that messy transition from a startup to an established enterprise, or honestly just someone trying to figure out how to handle a recent professional betrayal, this framework applies.
Oh, absolutely. It details how to build capability in exile, how to forge the instruments of your own agency, and crucially, and this is the hardest part, how to recognize when the very tools that saved you are starting to destroy you.
Yeah, that last phase, the renunciation of power. Because we're culturally conditioned to just focus on the acquisition of power, aren't we? Like we study how to get it, how to build the platform, how to capture the market.
Right, and this project argues that acquiring the power is just the midpoint. It's merely the midpoint of a much larger discipline. The true test of a sovereign operator is the intentional dismantling of their own centralized authority.
Wow. Okay, so to understand how we actually get to that dismantling, we have to start with the project's catalyst. There's this standalone track that sits outside the main chronological narrative of the album, and it acts as a kind of Rosetta Stone for the entire philosophy.
Yeah, it compresses the whole argument into a single claim, dropped right in the opening spoken passage. The line is, they call it magic. The ignorant always call science magic.
I love that line.
Yeah.
Because it performs this radical inversion of our assumed cultural knowledge. I mean, if you attend a standard theatrical production of The Tempest, Prospero is depicted as a sorcerer. He waves a wooden wand, he wears a mystical robe, he commands supernatural spirits.
Right, but the album proposes an entirely different reading. Prospero is a natural philosopher. He was exiled with his library of scientific texts. So his so-called magic is simply empirical methodology, specifically the methodology laid out by Sir Francis Bacon.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about how human beings process technological leaps. Like, I was thinking about this. If you travel back to the year 1610 and show an Elizabethan courtier a modern smartphone, they would absolutely classify it as sorcery.
Oh, 100%. They would assume you had bound some glowing spirit of light inside a rectangle of glass.
Exactly. Because the observer lacks the vocabulary for applied physics, or silicon architecture, or cellular networks. So they default to the language of magic. In this reading, Prospero is just an engineer stranded among people who don't understand the mechanisms he's building.
And the lyrics establish this empirical posture right out of the gate. The opening verse literally says, I don't wave a wooden wand, I observe and I react Baconian philosophy, the father of the fact. He is explicitly trading the apparatus of the occult for the apparatus of measurement.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate for a second here, especially for you listeners who know your Renaissance literature. Because it's super easy for a modern artist to just project a contemporary, Silicon Valley tech bro aesthetic onto a 400-year-old play just to make it sound edgy. Does the actual text of Shakespeare support this, or is it purely a stylistic overlay?
No, it's a great question, but the gravity here is substantial. Shakespeare's text presents Prospero as a man consumed by his studies, manipulating environmental conditions, and eventually dismantling his apparatus when his experiment concludes. The album just takes those events seriously through a different lens. And to anchor this, the track integrates Francis Bacon's actual taxonomy of intellectual errors from his 1620 treatise, Novum Organum.
Right, which translates to the new instrument, doesn't it?
Correct. Bacon was arguing against the dominant Aristotelian tradition back then, which relied heavily on deductive reasoning, starting with assumed grand philosophical premises and then trying to force the physical world to fit into those assumptions.
Working backward, basically.
Exactly. So Bacon demanded a new instrument for human understanding, which was inductive reasoning. You start by observing the physical world, taking measurements, and letting the data build the theory. But Bacon knew that before you could measure reality accurately, you had to clear your mind of inherent human biases. He categorized these biases into 4 idols.
And the artist explicitly weaves these into the lyrics. Let me find it. Yeah. I shatter all the idols of the theater for you. The idols of the marketplace, the idols of the cave. We should really unpack these because understanding these idols is critical to the concept of that Castle Alpha software architecture we'll get to later.
Let's do it. So Bacon starts with the idols of the tribe. These are the cognitive distortions hardwired into human nature itself. We inherently seek order, we jump to conclusions, and we see patterns where there is only randomness. It's basically the human tendency to trust our flawed senses implicitly.
Right. And then you have the idols of the cave, which narrows that distortion down to the individual. Like this is your personal background, your specific education, your trauma. If you spend your life reading only one type of book or talking to one type of person, you're viewing the universe from inside a very specific, isolated cave.
Yeah, the modern equivalent is absolutely the algorithmic echo chamber. Your social media feed feeds you a curated slice of reality, and you start to mistake that little cave for the entire world.
It's so true. Okay, what's the third one? The marketplace.
Yes, the idols of the marketplace. This addresses the distortions created by human interaction, specifically through language. Words are frequently ill-defined. We use terminology that obscures meaning rather than clarifying it.
Oh, like in a modern corporate setting. Think of words like synergy or alignment or optimization. People use these words in meetings, assuming everyone shares the same definition, but the language actually prevents any rigorous understanding of the underlying physical reality of the business.
That is exactly it. And finally, you have the idols of the theater. These are the grand, received, philosophical, religious, or scientific dogmas that people accept simply because of tradition. They're like stage plays, fictional worlds created by past authorities that we just accept as absolute truth.
So, like, you do things a certain way at your job because that's how it has always been done.
Yeah.
You're worshiping an idol of the theater instead of looking at the actual data.
Right. And by referencing these idols, the track signals its operational vocabulary. The artist grounds the narrative in Francis Bacon's most famous formulation, which is actually sampled directly in the beat Scientia Potentia Est. Knowledge is power.
But we have to understand how Bacon meant that, right? He didn't mean knowledge as some decorative intellectual status symbol.
No, not at all. He meant knowledge produces operational capability. If you accurately understand the laws of nature free from those 4 idols, you can build mechanisms to manipulate those laws.
Which introduces one of the most fascinating historical cipher elements of the album. Because there's this long-standing literary conspiracy theory that William Shakespeare didn't actually write his plays, and that Sir Francis Bacon was the true author. And verse 3 dives right into this. It goes, they debate the authorship, the cipher in the text, was it Francis or William, and who is coming next. The symmetry is absolute. The architect is one, standing at the center of the orbit of the sun.
Yeah, and the authorship debate usually just devolves into historical pedantry. What's structurally brilliant here is that the project refuses to arbitrate the debate. A true empiricist evaluates claims based on measurable evidence, not historical authority. By stating the architect is one, the album allows the ambiguity to serve the thesis. It suggests that the historical identity of the author is completely irrelevant.
The method matters more than the man.
Exactly. What matters is the continuity of the methodology.
The architect isn't necessarily a guy from Stratford or a guy from London. The architect is anyone who successfully deploys the discipline. The modern hip-hop producer synthesizing the samples is the architect. The software engineer building Castle Alpha is the architect. And you, listening right now, when you strip away your biases and look at the raw data of your life, you become the architect.
And you can actually hear this synthesis in the audio production that's described in the source notes. The underlying beat of this Catalyst track pairs a Renaissance harpsichord with heavy, contemporary hip-hop break instrumentation. Neither era dominates the other. They're layered together, arguing sonically that this empirical discipline is independent of time.
It sets up a whole philosophical framework so well. But recognizing the framework and actually executing it are two very different things. You can't just declare yourself an empirical observer while you're sitting comfortably in the middle of a corrupt, politically compromised environment. You have to change your physical location.
Right, which moves us into the chronological arc of the album, beginning with Phase 1 and 2, the incubator of exile and the discipline of study.
So Movement of Bull is titled The Exile, and the notes align this phase with Bacon's text, The Advancement of Learning. And the movement opens with a spoken line that aggressively challenges the standard interpretation of the original narrative. It says, Milan was a distraction, the island is a forge.
Which is a huge shift. Traditionally, Prospero being usurped by his brother Antonio and cast out of his dukedom in Milan is viewed as a tragedy. It's a terrible injustice. But the album argues that Milan, with all of its courtly politics, backstabbing, and status games, was actually a barrier to deep work.
He thought he was losing everything, but he was actually being granted a clearing.
Exactly. And the lyrics reinforce this realization. I traded in the crown for the compass and the square. We really have to consider the difference between a crown and a compass here.
Okay, let's unpack that. A crown represents political authority. It's an externally validated object-like. Its power only exists because other people agree to recognize it. If the court decides you're no longer duke, the crown is suddenly worthless.
But a compass is an instrument of internal physical measurement. It allows you to relate directly to physical reality.
Yeah. A piece of timber doesn't care if you're a duke.
Yeah.
It only cares if your measurements are precise. And for you listening, think about your own career for a second. How often do you chase the crown? You know, the new job title, a corner office, the inclusion in a specific high-level meeting, when what you really need to be doing is mastering the compass and the square. We spend years trying to manage optics when we should be mastering actual hard skills.
That's spot on. The album views Prospero's pre-exile life as deeply arrogant. He believed he could master the secrets of the universe while simultaneously playing the superficial political games of the court. His failure in Milan was the inevitable consequence of that divided attention.
So the exile isn't a punishment, it's a necessary correction.
Right. The discipline that emerges on the island corrects his initial arrogance. And this leads to a really fascinating lyrical reference involving another Shakespearean protagonist used as a contrast to Prospero.
Oh, the Hamlet comparison. Yeah, the verse says, you seem paralyzed, the Hamlets of the earth, gathering the evidence but doubting their own worth, caught inside the gap between the vision and the act. I have to say, it feels a little strange to drop Hamlet into a story about the Tempest.
It does, but it's a vital philosophical counterpoint. In this framework, Hamlet represents the failed empiricist. Just consider the plot of Hamlet. He encounters a ghost, which is essentially unverified, chaotic data. Instead of acting on blind faith, he decides to gather evidence. He stages a play to observe his uncle's reaction and verify his guilt.
So Hamlet observes. He measures.
He does, but he's entirely paralyzed by the data he gathers.
He gets stuck in the analysis phase. He has the data, but he can't execute the program.
Exactly. He's trapped in the gap between the vision and the act. Prospero, on the other hand, through the discipline of his exile, operationalizes the evidence. He doesn't just gather data to brood over it. He gathers data to build machinery. The lyrics state, no inductive reasoning to lead the mind astray. I measure the reality and let it point the way.
Oh, wait. I think you mean deductive reasoning there, right? Since Bacon favored inductive?
Yes. Sorry. No deductive reasoning to lead the mind astray. Good catch. You observe the reality first, and you let the measurements dictate the conclusion.
It's pure Baconian methodology. You don't start with a grand theory and selectively hunt for evidence to support it. Sonically, movement play is described as relying on this mournful, plodding cello and a heavy downbeat. It reflects the painful, unglamorous pace of displacement. He's just digging the foundation.
Which transitions seamlessly into Movement 2, the study. The subtitle here is Salomon's House, which is a reference to Francis Bacon's utopian novel New Atlantis, where he described an ideal research institution. The emotional shift from Movement 1 to Movement 2 represents a transition from the shock of displacement to a state of sustained hypnotic focus.
Yeah, the spoken intro says, the anger is gone, the revenge is secondary, now there is only the work. And from a narrative perspective, keeping an audience engaged during a phase of pure study is really tough. But the track achieves this by capturing what a genuine flow state feels like. He reframes his 12 years of isolation. The 12-year sentence ain't a prison, it's a grant to cultivate the soil and to finalize the plant.
That vocabulary shift from sentence to grant is profound. A sentence is punitive and imposed externally. A grant is generative. It provides the space and resources to build something new.
And the cultivation imagery is highly deliberate. You can't command a seed to grow faster through political decree. Soil dictates its own pace. The disciplined mind recognizes that serious work takes exactly the time it takes.
There's also a tiny detail in the creator's commentary that fundamentally changes the tone of this study phase. The artist notes that a single lyric was amended during the writing process. Initially, the line was, "I'm looking at the universe, exposing every flaw," but it was changed to, "I'm looking at the universe, exposing every law."
Wow. Flaw to law. That single-syllable change shifts the entire philosophical posture from arrogance to humility.
Yeah.
I mean, if you seek to expose nature's flaws, you're approaching reality with the assumption that it's defective and that you are there to correct it or exploit it. You're imposing your own desires onto the system.
You're acting like a tyrant toward reality itself.
Precisely. But seeking to expose nature's laws means you accept that the system is perfect in its mechanics, even if it is completely indifferent to you. You are studying its structure so you can align with it. The track translates a famous Latin maxim of Bacon's Natura non nisi perendo vincitur into modern hip-hop phrasing. To conquer the nature, you must first obey the law.
You can't write a new software architecture by yelling at the compiler that it's flawed. You have to obey the syntax. You have to submit to the logic of the system before the system will yield capability to you.
And the production of movement 2 mirrors this submission. It uses a muted trumpet, heavy sub-bass, and the ambient sound of rain to create this absorbing, trance-like environment. The mournful cello of the exile is totally gone.
However, a purely contemplative state is ultimately insufficient. The lyrics at the end of Movement 2 warn, "Knowledge without action is a heavy, rotting fruit. Pure theory must eventually be operationalized." This necessitates moving from the contemplative phases into the operational phases.
Which brings us to phase 3, forging the instruments. In Baconian terms, this is the application of the new instrument. In the narrative of the Tempest, this is where Prospero subjugates and deploys two specific entities, Ariel and Caliban.
Ariel and Caliban represent the dual-handed grasp of the empirical methodology. In traditional theater, Ariel is a sprite of the air, and Caliban is a deformed, earthbound creature. But in this project's platform philosophy, they represent the two fundamental layers of systems engineering.
Verse 2 lays it out beautifully. Ariel is the data, the network, the stream, the surgical precision of the laser beam, but you cannot build a castle with the laser alone. You need the heavy muscle just to carry the stone. This analogy is brilliant. Like, if Ariel's the blueprint, Caliban is the brick.
If we map this onto modern software architecture, that Castle Alpha concept we hinted at, Ariel is the invisible layer. Ariel represents cloud computing, API calls, data packets moving at the speed of light, the elegant logic of the code. It is frictionless, but pure code cannot exist in a vacuum.
Right, Ariel needs Caliban. Caliban is the physical infrastructure. He's the data centers, the massive cooling systems, the servers generating heat, the fiber optic cables buried at the bottom of the ocean. Caliban is friction, gravity, voltage, and sweat. You can have the most beautiful, frictionless software architecture in your mind, but if you don't account for the brutal physical realities of the hardware, your system will just crash.
Lyrics emphasize this subjugation. I subjugate Caliban, the primitive brute, the raw material buried deep down in the root. Now, we have to acknowledge that in standard literary criticism, Prospero's relationship with Caliban is heavily critiqued through a post-colonial lens. Prospero arrives on an island and enslaves the native inhabitant.
Which is a completely valid critique of the original text.
Yeah.
Prospero basically acts like a colonizer. So how does this project handle that incredibly messy dynamic?
By fundamentally shifting the register of the narrative from the political to the material. In this project, Caliban is not a human subject. He represents unrefined physical matter. The subjugation isn't about colonial dominance over indigenous populations. It is about an engineer harnessing the raw, chaotic forces of nature, like thermodynamics and electrical current, to serve a deliberate design. And the project uses an intentional historical anachronism to prove this point.
Oh, right. The lyrics mention extracting the absolute power from the uranium. Obviously, Shakespeare had no concept of nuclear physics, But the methodology holds. Whether you're using a medieval forge, or splitting the atom in the 20th century, or building server farms for machine learning today, you're extracting power from raw material.
And the sonic landscape of Movement 3 matches this perfectly. It blends a hammered dulcimer with aggressive glitch synths and highly complex polyrhythmic clockwork drum patterns. The production feels hot and mechanical. It's the sound of an engine starting.
And the track concludes with a shift into pure operational vocabulary. Power levels maximum, all systems online, phase 4 is imminent, which sets the stage for the narrative climax. Movement 4, the action. This is the titular Tempest. The storm finally hits the royal fleet, carrying the very men who exiled Prospero 12 years ago. But the lyrics remind us again, there is no magic in the wind. It isn't a genie. It's violent mathematics washing over every sin.
Structurally, Movement 4 faces a significant challenge, because after 3 tracks of patient build-up and study, if the climax is merely an explosive spectacle of revenge, it undermines the entire philosophy of the album. The climax succeeds because it frames the storm not as chaotic rage, but as a rigid application of the discipline Prospero has forged.
There is a deep, satisfying irony in how the victims experience the storm, too. The verse says, "The royal fleet is sailing, thinking they control the sea, oblivious to everything they orchestrated me to be." The men on the ship think they're the apex predators of their political world. They don't realize that their past betrayal of Prospero actually forced him into the incubator that created the weapon currently destroying them.
It is the ultimate consequence of their arrogance. By acting politically against a man who would go on to master physics, they engineered their own destruction. And Prospero demonstrates this mastery using a very specific scientific phenomenon.
I flip the heavy switch. I let the Ariel ignite St. Elmo's fire burning on the rigging in the night. I have to admit, I always thought St. Elmo's Fire was just the title of an 80s movie. I had no idea what it actually meant until I looked at these notes.
It's a real-world phenomenon in plasma physics. During thunderstorms, a continuous electrical discharge can occur on pointed objects in a strong electric field, like a ship's mast. For centuries, sailors would see this glowing blue plasma and interpret it as supernatural, as spirits dancing in the rigging.
So the artist is collapsing all the layers into one image. The sailors see magic. The original audience saw Shakespearean spirits, but the empirical engineer knows it is just plasma physics. And Prospero uses this physical reality to mock their artificial societal power. He modifies a line from the play. "What care these heavy roars for the title of a king? The physics of the ocean doesn't care about a ring." I mean, a tidal wave does not respect your job title. A server crash does not care about your net worth.
But this brings us to a critical, ethical, and structural question, one that you hinted at earlier. If Prospero is simply unleashing a devastating weapon against his former political rivals, how is he fundamentally any different from the tyrants he despises? Is this entire album just an elaborate justification for a revenge fantasy?
I am so glad you brought this up because I really have to push back on Prospero here. It's very easy to claim you're operating on a higher empirical plane when you are the one holding the remote control to a hurricane. Violent mathematics sounds like a very convenient, sterilized excuse for a guy throwing a god-tier temper tantrum. Isn't he just acting out of spite?
If he were simply acting out of spite, he would destroy the ship and drown everyone on board. But the lyrics explicitly counter that interpretation. I'm separating every single body going down. But nobody is dying. The perimeter is strictly set. I'm just collecting payment on the universal debt.
Ah, the perimeter is strictly set. So the vengeance is bounded.
Exactly. Vengeance without discipline is merely cruelty. It's a loss of control. But vengeance bounded by strict operational parameters is a demonstration of structural superiority. He tracks the trajectory of every single person on the ship. The violence has an engineered upper limit. This perfectly aligns with the original text, where Prospero assures his daughter that not so much as a hair on anyone's head has been harmed. He isn't executing them. He's shattering their illusion of control.
He strips them of the idols they worship. He shows them that their political authority is a joke compared to the physical laws of the universe. Sonically, Movement 4 is the most chaotic track on the album. Massive thunderclaps, frantic harpsichord arpeggios, heavy driving breakbeats. It feels like you are inside the storm.
However, the true brilliance of the project is what happens next. At the very end of this chaotic triumph, the tempo begins to drag, the adrenaline fades. The outro poses the question that changes the entire trajectory of the album. The board is set, the pieces are captured, now to do with the power.
And that question pulls us into what I think is the most profound part of this entire deep dive. Movement V, the renunciation. It's subtitled Grounding the Book. If movement fourth was the blockbuster action movie climax, movement V is the philosophical gut punch. Because in almost every story we tell, whether it's a movie, a biography of a tech founder, a historical epic, the narrative ends when the protagonist secures absolute power. The enemies are defeated, the platform is built, the IPO is successful, the end.
This project argues that stopping the narrative there is a failure of discipline. The renunciation phase is essential. It's the willingness to intentionally dismantle the apparatus of power that took decades to build. To communicate this sonically, the production literally empties out.
The notes describe the tempo dropping to 78 BPM. It is a slow, heavy, deliberate pace. And during the hook, there is a literal 1-second beat break of absolute silence. It forces you, the listener, to sit in the void that is left when the machinery stops.
The intro to this movement contains a philosophical pivot that redefines everything we have seen so far. They think the power is in the object, in the staff, in the book, in the machine. They don't realize the machine was just a mirror.
The mirror concept is vital here. We spent 4 movements watching Prospero build the lab, subjugate Ariel and Caliban, and engineer a storm. We assumed, just as the characters on the ship assumed, that the machine was the point of the exercise. But he realizes the machine was never the end goal. It was a mirror reflecting his own internal development. The capability was just the means to forge the operator.
Once the operator reaches full sovereignty, the external apparatus is no longer necessary. In fact, retaining it becomes dangerous. The lyrics observe. Holding the lightning is burning up the hand. The power becomes just a heavy iron chain, a permanent storm residing in the brain.
A permanent storm residing in the brain. Think about what happens to people who hold on to absolute power for too long. Dictators, legacy CEOs, or even just people who define themselves entirely by a grudge they hold against someone else. They become paranoid. They have to constantly maintain the machinery of control. They start living in an unreality because the power isolates them from ground truth. The very tools that made them strong eventually trap them.
This leads to the most important analogy of the entire project. It's the metaphor that justifies the destruction of the lab.
The scaffolding metaphor. Let me read the verse. You build up the scaffolding to elevate the stone, to build up the castle and to solidify the throne. But when the construction is finally complete and the structure is standing incredibly elite, you got to tear the scaffolding completely to the ground, or the actual beauty of the building isn't found.
It is a perfect translation of construction mechanics into philosophical truth. Scaffolding is genuinely necessary. You cannot build a tower without it. But scaffolding is inherently temporary. If a builder refuses to take the scaffolding down out of fear that the building might collapse, it means they don't trust the foundation they built. And if the scaffolding remains, the architecture is obscured.
You listening to this right now, think about the scaffolding in your own life. Maybe you developed a hyper-defensive, aggressive personality trait to survive a really toxic workplace early in your career. It was scaffolding. It protected you. It allowed you to build your career. But if you are now a senior leader and you are still acting aggressively defensive, you are refusing to tear down the scaffolding. You are obscuring your own actual leadership potential. You're holding on to a tool that has outlived its purpose.
This creates the core political distinction of the project, articulated in 2 devastating lines. A tyrant holds the weapon cause he terrified to lose. A sovereign drops the weapon cause he has the right to choose.
Let's just sit with that distinction. The difference between a tyrant and a sovereign has nothing to do with the weapon itself. They both built the weapon. They both hold the weapon. The difference is entirely internal.
A tyrant is defined by compulsion. They are bound by what they hold. Their identity is so fragile that if they drop the weapon, they cease to exist. Therefore, they are terrified. A sovereign is defined by freedom from compulsion. They possess the capability to destroy their enemies, but they recognize that the choice to drop the weapon is the ultimate manifestation of actual power.
And so, Prospero enacts the destruction. He walks to the cliff. He snaps the heavy wooden staff in 2. He takes his book of empirical data, locks it in heavy iron, and drops it into the Mariana Rock, the deepest trench in the ocean. Drowning the knowledge, returning it to deep, the heaviest secret that the ocean gonna keep.
The destruction of the book is the destruction of the centralized control mechanism. In software terms, he is permanently deleting the admin keys. He ensures that nobody, not even himself, can ever wield that specific concentrated power again. And the track anticipates the listener's confusion, explicitly stating, "It ain't a surrender, it isn't a defeat, it's the final calculation making everything complete."
By giving up the universe, he conquers his fear of losing it. The scaffolding is gone. The discipline is fully internalized. But that creates a massive narrative problem, which brings us to the final phase, Movement 6, The Return.
The subtitle is The Duke of Nothing. Structurally, this is the most difficult needle to thread. How does a narrative realistically depict a return to mundane society for someone who has wielded and then renounced the power of a god? A triumphant return feels fundamentally hollow, and a depressing fade into obscurity betrays the discipline.
The project finds a brilliant third option. Prospero returns to Milan, and the court is exactly the same as when he left it. The same gossip, the same petty political posturing. But the intro notes, I left this city as a victim, I returned to it as an architect, but the city looks so small now, the title is just a word.
The feeling is not one of moral superiority, but of structural incompatibility. He has been fundamentally reshaped by serious physical work. He simply cannot interface with the superficial social structures anymore. They bowing at the feet and they whispering the name, but I'm standing completely disconnected from the game.
The people bowing to him aren't necessarily evil, they're just unawakened. They never endured the incubator of exile. They still believe the idols of the theater are real. And this structural disconnect radically redefines how the album handles the concept of forgiveness. The verse says, I forgive the transgression, not because I have to bend, but because the petty rivalry has come into its end.
In most literature, forgiveness is portrayed as a grueling moral achievement. A protagonist wrestles with their dark desire for revenge and ultimately chooses to be virtuous. This album proposes something much colder, but arguably more profound. Forgiveness here is a byproduct of structural indifference.
The rivalry just literally doesn't matter to him anymore. He isn't straining to be a good person.
Yeah.
He has just evolved into a state where Antonio's political backstabbing is as irrelevant to him as a child stealing a toy. The warlord is dead. The sovereign is alive. The warlord needs to deploy force to prove he exists. The sovereign has the internal compass set and needs to prove nothing.
And it is here, in the final moments of the narrative, that the project explicitly names the modern application of its philosophy. The Castle Alpha framework, the lyric state. It doesn't even matter. The compass is internal. The legacy of Castle Alpha, absolute, eternal.
For the entire deep dive, we've talked about Bacon, Shakespeare, and Prospero. But Castle Alpha is the ultimate translation of this narrative into contemporary software platform philosophy. Think about what a truly decentralized software platform is.
A standard software application is designed to keep you dependent on it. It operates like Milan. It demands your constant engagement, your data, and your subscription. A platform built on the Castle Alpha philosophy is designed like Salomon's house. It is a structure built to empower the user, to grant them operational sovereignty, and ultimately to allow them to outgrow the platform itself.
The architect of a Castle Alpha system builds the massive, complex machinery, the aerial network, and the Caliban hardware. But they design it so that the users inherit the capability without needing the architect's permission. The creator of the platform intentionally steps away. They drown the book.
The narrative mirrors this generational transmission. Prospero doesn't stay in Milan to lecture everyone on empirical science. He orchestrates the marriage of his daughter Miranda to his enemy's son Ferdinand. The marriage to Ferdinand, the bridging of the gap, I am rewriting the borders on the generational map. The discipline is transmitted structurally. The next generation inherits the new reality by living inside the architecture he built.
And once that structure is secure, his work is truly finished, a master of the universe who put the tools away. He can sit in the courtyard watching the politicians chase clout, utterly at peace. And to close the project, the artist executes a stunning metafictional maneuver. They directly translate the actual epilogue of Shakespeare's The Tempest.
In the original play, the actor playing Prospero steps forward and asks the audience to applaud, stating that their applause is the breath that will fill his sails and set him free from the fiction of the play. The hip-hop artist translates this into a direct request to you, the listener. I ask for the indulgence from the people in the stands to sever the connection and release me from the bands.
The artist is saying, I built this massive 7-track concept album. I built the storm for you, but the argument is now complete. If you demand more of this specific story, you are demanding I keep the scaffolding up. You must release the artist, just as the artist released the power.
The cycle must close. As the warm strings and the steady drum breaks slowly fade out, leaving a profound, peaceful silence, the final lyrics establish his ultimate identity. I walk through the streets, anonymous and free, the Duke of Nothing, just exactly who I be.
The Duke of Nothing. The title is restored, but it holds no weight over his ego. The discipline produced an operator whose identity is entirely independent of his accolades. The laboratory is dark, the architect is home.
To summarize the trajectory of this discipline, we began in the harsh incubator of exile, realizing that losing external validation was a necessary clearing. We committed to the humble study of reality, seeking to obey its laws rather than exploit its flaws. We forged the heavy instruments of our agency, marrying data with physical friction. We deployed that capability with strict, bounded discipline. We then passed the ultimate test of renunciation, tearing down the scaffolding to ensure we did not become the tyrants we sought to escape. Finally, we returned to the world, possessing an internal compass that renders external rivalries obsolete.
It is a complete blueprint for transcendent sovereignty. So as you go back to your work, your relationships, your building today, we ask you to evaluate your own architecture. Where are you still worshiping the idols of the marketplace? Where are you confusing the scaffolding for the actual building? True sovereignty isn't about how much power you can accumulate. True sovereignty is possessing the absolute capability to hold the weapon and having the profound internal freedom to drop it.
However, this leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question regarding the nature of this journey. The framework we've analyzed requires a person to endure the exile, build the massive apparatus, and command the storm before they can achieve the enlightenment of renouncing it. But is it possible to achieve the peaceful sovereignty of the dupe of nothing without ever having built the storm in the first place? Or is the dangerous, exhausting, and corrupting accumulation of absolute power an unavoidable prerequisite for true liberation?
We will leave you to untangle those muddy waters on your own.